Principal Victoria Morrison sat behind her mahogany desk reviewing the disciplinary file with grim satisfaction. 15 years as principal of Riverside Preparatory Academy had taught her that maintaining the school's reputation meant making difficult decisions. And today's decision, while certain to upset the students' parents, was necessary. The file belonged to Jamal Richardson, a junior who'd been at Riverside Prep for 3 years. His academic record was solid: 3.7 GPA, honor roll, advanced placement classes. But his disciplinary record told a different story, at least according to Victoria's interpretation. 6 incidents in 3 years. Each one minor on its own, but taken together, they painted a picture of a troublemaker who didn't respect authority and disrupted the carefully maintained order of Riverside Prep. Incident 1. Speaking out in class without raising his hand, 3 times in 1 week. Incident 2. Questioning a history teacher's presentation of Civil War causes, suggesting the curriculum minimized slavery's central role. Incident 3. Organizing students to petition for more diverse literature in English classes. Incident 4. Wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt to school, which violated the No Political Statements dress code. Incident 5. Recording a substitute teacher who used a racial slur, then reporting it to administration. Incident 6. Challenging the school's decision to cancel a planned assembly on systemic racism, calling it cowardice in an email that was forwarded to Victoria. To Victoria, this pattern was clear. Jamal Richardson was a disruptive influence who prioritized his personal agenda over the school's harmony. He questioned authority, challenged established norms, and encouraged other students to do the same. To anyone else, the pattern might look different. A bright student advocating for more inclusive education, standing up against racism, and exercising his First Amendment rights. But Victoria saw what she wanted to see, and what she saw was a problem that needed to be eliminated. She pressed her intercom. "Susan, please send in the Richardsons." Jamal entered with his parents, Marcus and Angela Richardson. Jamal was 17, tall and lean, wearing the Riverside Prep uniform with the careful attention of someone who knew he was already under scrutiny. His parents were dressed professionally, Marcus in a suit, Angela in a blazer and dress, both carrying the composed bearing of people accustomed to difficult conversations. "Please, sit down," Victoria said, her tone suggesting this was a formality rather than a genuine invitation. They sat. Jamal looked nervous. His parents looked alert, already sensing this wasn't a routine parent-teacher conference. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Victoria began. "I'm afraid we have a serious matter to discuss regarding Jamal's continued enrollment at Riverside Prep." Angela's expression sharpened. "Continued enrollment? What's happened?" "Over the past 3 years, Jamal has accumulated a disciplinary record that I can no longer overlook. 6 separate incidents of disruptive behavior, disrespect for authority, and violation of school policies." Marcus leaned forward. "Can you be specific about these incidents?" Victoria slid the file across her desk. "It's all documented. Speaking out of turn, challenging teachers, organizing protests, violating dress code, recording staff without permission, and most recently, sending an inflammatory email criticizing school administration." Angela read through the file, her expression growing colder with each page. "These aren't disciplinary incidents. This is a student engaging with his education. That's your interpretation. Mine is that Jamal has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to follow rules and respect authority. Riverside Prep maintains its excellent reputation through discipline and order. Students who cannot abide by our standards are not a good fit for our community." "So, you're punishing him for thinking critically?" Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I'm addressing a pattern of disruptive behavior, and I've made the decision to recommend expulsion." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Jamal's face went pale. "Expulsion? For what? I haven't done anything wrong. You violated school policy 6 times. I questioned a teacher's biased curriculum." Jamal interrupted, his voice rising. "I asked for more diverse books. I stood up against racism. Those aren't violations. Those are rights. At Riverside Prep, those are disruptions. We have procedures for suggesting curriculum changes. We have channels for addressing concerns. You circumvented those channels, organized other students to protest, and created division within our community." Angela set the file down carefully. "Let me make sure I understand. You're expelling our son for advocating against racism and for educational equity. I'm expelling him for repeated violations of school policy and disrespect for authority. The substitute teacher he recorded without permission used the N-word in class. He documented racism to protect himself and other students. And you're punishing him for it?" Victoria's expression didn't change. The teacher was immediately terminated. But Jamal violated policy by recording on school grounds without permission. Rules apply to everyone equally. "Do they?" Marcus asked quietly. "Because I'm looking at this file and I see 6 incidents in 3 years. None of them involving violence, drugs, cheating, or any genuinely harmful behavior. Just a black student refusing to stay quiet about injustice. This isn't about race. It's always about race when a black student is punished for behaviors that white students exhibit without consequence," Angela said. "How many white students have questioned teachers? Worn political shirts? Sent critical emails? Were any of them expelled? This isn't a productive conversation. You're right, it's not. Because you've already made your decision." Marcus stood. "We'll be appealing this expulsion. And we'll be bringing it to the school board's attention." Victoria allowed herself a small smile. "That's your right. But I should warn you that the board typically supports administrative decisions in disciplinary matters. Your appeal is unlikely to succeed." "We'll see about that," Angela said, also standing. "Come on, Jamal. Let's go." They left Victoria's office and she returned to her paperwork feeling vindicated. She'd handled it professionally, documented everything properly. The board would review the appeal, see the pattern of violations, and uphold her decision. In a month, Jamal Richardson would be gone, and Riverside Prep would return to its orderly, harmonious state. What Victoria didn't know, what Jamal's parents had carefully avoided mentioning, was that Marcus Richardson was a member of the State Board of Education, and Angela Richardson was the Deputy Secretary of Education for the state. They'd kept their positions quiet deliberately. They wanted Jamal to have a normal school experience, not one colored by his parents' professional influence. They'd chosen Riverside Prep for its academic reputation, not realizing that the school's definition of excellence meant conformity rather than critical thinking. Now, driving home with their son in the back seat, they made a decision. "We're not just appealing to the school board," Marcus said. "We're investigating the entire school." "Agreed," Angela replied. "If they're punishing Jamal for advocating against racism, how are they treating other students of color? What's happening in classrooms we don't see?" "I didn't want to use your positions," Jamal said quietly from the back seat. "I wanted to fix things myself." "You tried," Marcus said, "and they punished you for it." Sometimes you need backup. 2 days later, Victoria received notice that the Richardson family had filed a formal appeal with the school board. She wasn't worried. She'd prepared a comprehensive presentation showing Jamal's pattern of disruptive behavior, complete with documentation, teacher statements, and policy citations. The appeal hearing was scheduled for the following week. What Victoria didn't know was that Marcus and Angela had spent those 2 days conducting their own investigation. They'd spoken with other parents of color at Riverside Prep. They'd reviewed disciplinary records through a public information request. They'd interviewed teachers who'd left the school in recent years. And what they'd found was damning. Students of color at Riverside Prep were disciplined at 3 times the rate of white students for identical behaviors. Disruption charges were almost exclusively applied to Black and Latino students. The curriculum heavily emphasized European history and literature while minimizing diverse perspectives. Teacher turnover was high among educators of color, many citing a hostile administrative environment. Riverside Prep's reputation for excellence excellence, was built on a foundation of conformity enforced through discriminatory discipline. The school board hearing took place in Riverside Prep's library, a wood-paneled room that smelled of old books and furniture polish. 7 board members sat at a long table, all white, all wealthy, all longtime supporters of Victoria's leadership. Victoria presented first, her presentation polished and professional. She walked through each of Jamal's 6 incidents, framing them as clear violations of established policy. Riverside Prep maintains its standards through consistent enforcement of rules, she concluded. When a student repeatedly violates those rules and shows no willingness to comply, expulsion becomes necessary to protect the educational environment for other students. The board members nodded along. This was the Victoria they knew, firm, fair, committed to excellence. Then Marcus and Angela Richardson stood to present their appeal. Victoria noticed for the first time that they'd brought materials, folders, printed documents, a laptop. This wasn't going to be an emotional plea from upset parents. This was going to be something else. "Thank you for hearing our appeal," Marcus began. "Before we discuss Jamal's specific case, I'd like to share some context about Riverside Prep's disciplinary practices." He pulled up a slide showing suspension and expulsion data for the past 5 years, broken down by race. Black students represent 12% of Riverside Prep's population, but account for 43% of disciplinary actions. Latino students are 15% of the population, but 31% of discipline cases. White students are 68% of the population, but only 26% of discipline cases. The board members shifted uncomfortably. "More specifically," Angela continued, pulling up another slide, "the charge of disruption, or disrespect for authority, is applied to students of color at a rate 340% higher than white students for identical behaviors. We have documentation of white students questioning teachers, organizing petitions, and wearing political clothing without any disciplinary consequence." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "I object to this characterization. We discipline based on behavior, not race." "Do you?" Marcus asked. "Because we have affidavits from 6 teachers who left Riverside Prep in the past 3 years. All 6 describe an administration that pressured them to be stricter with students of color, to document incidents that would never have been flagged for white students." He handed copies of the affidavits to the board members. "One teacher describes being told that a black student's questioning of curriculum was disruptive, while a white student's identical questions were engaged learning. Another describes being instructed to write up a Latino student for speaking Spanish in the hallway, something that violates no school policy because it made other students uncomfortable." The board members were reading now, their expressions growing more troubled. "Our son's first incident," Angela said, "was speaking without raising his hand 3 times in 1 week. We obtained testimony from students in that class. 7 white students spoke out of turn more frequently with no documentation. The teacher confirmed this but said she was encouraged by administration to note any disruptive behavior from diverse students." "That's a mischaracterization," Victoria tried to interrupt. "His 4th incident was wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, supposedly violating the no political statements policy. Yet, we have photographs from the same week showing 5 white students wearing MAGA hats and Trump 2024 shirts with no consequences." Marcus pulled up the photos on his laptop. There they were, white students in clear violation of the same policy that had gotten Jamal documented. "The substitute teacher incident," Angela continued, "involved a teacher using a racial slur in class. Jamal recorded it to protect himself and provide evidence. Principal Morrison's response was to fire the substitute, good, but also to punish Jamal for recording without permission. She prioritized protecting the school's reputation over supporting a student who'd experienced racism." The board was silent now, really looking at the evidence. "The most recent incident," Marcus said, "was Jamal writing an email criticizing the school's decision to cancel an assembly on systemic racism. He called the decision cowardice. Principal Morrison considered this grounds for expulsion. Yet, when a white parent sent an email calling the same proposed assembly divisive indoctrination, he was thanked for his input and invited to join a parent advisory committee. Victoria stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're cherry-picking examples to support a narrative. We have 47 documented examples," Angela said calmly. "Would you like to review them all?" The room went quiet. One of the board members, an elderly man named Robert, cleared his throat. "These are serious allegations. If true, they suggest systemic discrimination rather than individual disciplinary issues." "They're not true," Victoria insisted. "This is a coordinated attack by parents upset that their son faced consequences for his behavior." "Is it?" Marcus asked. "Or is it an accurate assessment by two education professionals who have extensive experience in identifying discriminatory practices?" He paused, letting the question hang. "I should have introduced myself properly at the start," Marcus continued. "I'm Dr. Marcus Richardson. I serve on the State Board of Education, where I chair the Equity and Access Committee. My work focuses specifically on identifying and addressing discriminatory disciplinary practices in schools." The board members' expressions changed, some to shock, others to growing horror. "And I'm Dr. Angela Richardson," Angela added. "I serve as Deputy Secretary of Education for the state. A significant portion of my work involves investigating schools for civil rights violations and discriminatory practices." Victoria felt the room tilt. She gripped the edge of the table for support. "We didn't mention our positions initially because we wanted to address this as parents first," Marcus said. "We hoped the school board would review the evidence objectively and recognize the discrimination without needing to invoke our professional authority. But since Principal Morrison characterized our concerns as mere upset parents with an unfounded narrative," Angela continued, "we'll be explicit. What's happening at Riverside Prep isn't just wrong. It's illegal. It violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and it creates a hostile educational environment for students of color." Robert, the board member, looked at Victoria. "Did you know who these parents were?" "No," Victoria whispered. "Would it have mattered?" Angela asked pointedly. "Would you have treated our son differently if you'd known his parents held positions of authority? Because that's part of the problem. Students shouldn't need powerful parents to receive fair treatment." The hearing that was supposed to uphold Jamal's expulsion became something else entirely. The board reviewed all 47 documented examples of discriminatory discipline. They examined the curriculum bias. They read teacher testimonies about administrative pressure to target students of color. By the end, Victoria's expulsion recommendation wasn't just denied, it was condemned. "This expulsion was clearly retaliatory," Robert said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "A student advocated for equity, challenged discriminatory practices, and was punished for it. That's not discipline. That's suppression." Another board member added, "And the pattern we're seeing suggests this isn't isolated. This is systemic. Principal Morrison, you're suspended pending a full investigation into disciplinary practices at Riverside Prep." Victoria's face went white. "Suspended? For enforcing school policy?" "For enforcing policy discriminatorily," Robert corrected. "Dr. and Dr. Richardson, we apologize. To you and to Jamal. This school failed him. We failed him. And we'll be taking immediate steps to address these issues." But Marcus and Angela weren't satisfied with just an apology. "The state will be conducting its own investigation," Marcus said. "Not just into this incident, but into Riverside Prep's practices over the past 5 years. If we find evidence of systematic civil rights violations, and we will, there will be consequences beyond just suspension." Within 2 weeks, the state investigation was underway. Interviews with students, parents, and former teachers revealed a pattern even worse than the initial evidence suggested. Teachers had been instructed to document concerning behaviors from students of color while ignoring identical behaviors from white students. Students of color consistently received harsher punishments for the same infractions. The curriculum minimized contributions from non-European cultures and perspectives. Guidance counselors steered students of color toward vocational tracks while encouraging white students toward college preparatory courses, regardless of academic performance. Riverside Prep's reputation for excellence was built on making it hostile to anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of model student, which happened to align closely with white, wealthy, and compliant. Victoria Morrison was terminated after the investigation revealed she'd actively cultivated this culture. Emails showed her instructing teachers to be stricter with certain students, using coded language that clearly meant students of color. She'd overridden teacher recommendations to advance students of color, claiming they weren't Riverside Prep material, despite having higher grades than white students who were advanced. The school board was restructured to include more diverse representation. New policies explicitly prohibited discriminatory discipline and established oversight to ensure consistent enforcement. The curriculum was reviewed and expanded to include more diverse perspectives. Teacher training focused on recognizing and combating implicit bias. 6 months after the expulsion hearing, Jamal Richardson returned to Riverside Prep under a new principal who'd been hired specifically to reform the school's culture. On his first day back, several students approached him, students of color who'd stayed quiet during his battle with Victoria, afraid of becoming targets themselves. "Thank you," a Latina sophomore named Maria told him. "I got written up 3 times last year for things my friends did but never got in trouble for." "I thought it was just me. Thought I was being too sensitive." "It wasn't just you," Jamal said. "It was never just you." A black freshman named David added, "My older brother went here 5 years ago. Got expelled for repeated disruptions. Reading about your case, I realized he was expelled for the same stuff I see white kids do every day. Made me understand it wasn't his fault. None of it was anyone's fault except the people in charge who made it happen," Jamal said. A year after the expulsion hearing, Jamal was invited to speak at a state education conference about student advocacy and combating discriminatory discipline. Standing before a room full of educators and administrators, he was nervous but determined. "When I started speaking up at Riverside Prep," he began, "I didn't think of myself as an activist. I was just a student who saw things that weren't right and thought someone should say something. Turns out, when you're a black student in a predominantly white school, saying something makes you a troublemaker." He paused, looking around the room. "I was documented for speaking without raising my hand, for questioning biased curriculum, for asking for more diverse books, for wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, for recording a teacher who used a slur, for criticizing administrative decisions. 6 incidents in 3 years. Not one involving violence, drugs, academic dishonesty, or any genuinely harmful behavior. Just a black student refusing to stay silent about racism. My principal decided that made me a threat, so she tried to expel me. What she didn't know was that my parents are Dr. Marcus Richardson, State Board of Education member, and Dr. Angela Richardson, Deputy Secretary of Education. She didn't know that they had the expertise to recognize discriminatory practices and the authority to do something about it. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. What if my parents weren't who they are? What if they didn't have education degrees and positions of power? What if they were working-class parents without the resources to fight back? I would have been expelled. My record would have been ruined. And Riverside Prep would have continued its discriminatory practices because no one with the power to stop it would have known. That's the reality for most students facing discrimination. They don't have parents who sit on education boards. They don't have the resources to conduct investigations or hire lawyers. They suffer in silence or they fight and lose. My case got attention because of who my parents are, but it should have gotten attention because of what was happening, regardless of who my parents were. The audience was silent, many nodding in recognition. So, my message to educators is this: treat every student like their parents might be on the State Board of Education. Not because you're afraid of consequences, but because every student deserves that level of respect and fair treatment. Every student deserves to have their advocacy taken seriously, their concerns addressed, their voices heard. And when a student speaks up about injustice, your first response shouldn't be, "How do I silence this disruption?" It should be, "What is this student trying to tell me about our school?" The applause was sustained and genuine. 2 years after the expulsion hearing, Riverside Prep's culture had genuinely transformed. Disciplinary rates for students of color had dropped to proportional levels. The curriculum included diverse perspectives throughout, not just during designated heritage months. Students felt empowered to speak up without fear of retaliation. Victoria Morrison never worked in education again. Her reputation followed her. The principal who tried to expel a student for advocating against racism, who was caught running a discriminatory discipline system, who targeted students of color while protecting white students engaging in identical behaviors. She'd spent 15 years building that reputation, and it took one hearing to destroy it. On Jamal's graduation day, he stood before his class as valedictorian, a position he'd earned with a 4.0 GPA his senior year and leadership in the school's equity committee. His speech was short but pointed. 3 years ago, I was almost expelled from this school for speaking up about injustice. Today, I'm graduating as valedictorian. What changed wasn't me. I'm the same person who questioned biased curriculum, who advocated for diverse literature, who refused to stay quiet about racism. What changed was that someone finally listened. My parents had the power to make the school listen, and they used it not just for me, but for every student who'd been targeted by discriminatory practices. But the real change came when this school decided to do better. When the board restructured itself. When they hired a principal who believed in equity. When teachers were trained to recognize and combat bias. When students were empowered to speak up without fear. That's the lesson. Change is possible. But it requires people in power to listen to those without power. It requires systems to be held accountable. And it requires all of us to keep speaking up, even when, especially when, people try to silence us. The applause from his classmates was thunderous. 5 years after the expulsion hearing, Jamal was in college studying education policy, following in his parents' footsteps. He was contacted by a filmmaker making a documentary about discriminatory discipline in schools. "Your case became a catalyst," the filmmaker told him. "It led to investigations at 17 other schools in the state." Hundreds of students had their disciplinary records reviewed and expunged. Administrators who ran discriminatory systems were removed. Policies were reformed. "That's good," Jamal said, "but it shouldn't have required my parents being who they are." "No," the filmmaker agreed, "but it did require someone with power deciding to use it for change. Your parents could have just gotten you unexpelled and moved on. Instead, they forced systemic accountability." The documentary ended with footage of Jamal back at Riverside Prep, now as a guest speaker in a class discussing civil rights and student advocacy. A student raised her hand. "Were you scared when you were fighting the expulsion?" "Terrified," Jamal admitted. "I thought my academic future was over, but I was also angry, because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and I had parents who validated that feeling, who fought for me, who used their positions to demand accountability." "What if your parents didn't have those positions?" another student asked. "Then I probably would have lost. And that's the injustice we have to keep fighting. The fact that justice often depends on who you know, what power you have, what resources you can access. That's not real justice. Real justice is when every student gets fair treatment regardless of whether their parents sit on education boards." The class was quiet, processing. "But since we don't have real justice yet," Jamal continued, "we need people with power to use it for those without power. We need education professionals to recognize discrimination when they see it. And we need students to keep speaking up, even when, especially when, people try to silence them." A decade after the expulsion hearing, Marcus and Angela Richardson were invited to speak at the same education conference where Jamal had spoken years earlier. 10 years ago, Marcus began, Our son was nearly expelled for advocating against racism in his school. We used our positions, our expertise, and our authority to stop it. But we've spent the past decade thinking about what that means. We were lucky, Angela continued. We had the knowledge to recognize discrimination, the expertise to document it, and the authority to demand accountability. Most parents don't have those advantages. Most students facing discrimination suffer in silence or fight and lose. So we've made it our mission, Marcus said, to use our positions to amplify those voices. To investigate schools proactively, not just reactively. To hold systems accountable before students have to fight battles they shouldn't have to fight. Because every student deserves what our son got. Not special treatment because of who his parents are, but fair treatment because that's what every student deserves. The conference room erupted in applause. Later, in a quieter moment, a young teacher approached them. I teach at a school where I see discriminatory discipline every day, but I'm junior faculty. I have no power. What can I do? You have more power than you think, Angela said. You can document what you see. You can speak up in faculty meetings. You can contact your state education department. You can refuse to participate in discriminatory practices even if others pressure you. And you can tell students like our son that they're right to speak up, Marcus added, that their advocacy matters, that someone hears them even if the administration doesn't. That validation can make all the difference. The teacher nodded, determination settling over her features. Because that's what real change looks like. Not just one dramatic hearing where powerful parents saved their son, but 1,000 small decisions by teachers, administrators, parents, and students to choose equity over comfort, justice over order, truth over silence. Jamal Richardson was almost expelled for refusing to stay quiet about injustice. Instead, his voice, amplified by parents who knew how to make systems listen, became a catalyst for change that protected hundreds of other students from similar discrimination. And somewhere in a classroom at Riverside Prep, a student speaks up about something that isn't right, and instead of being silenced, they're heard. That's the legacy of one expulsion hearing that became a reckoning. If this story resonated with you, remember, students who advocate for justice aren't troublemakers. They're leaders. Schools that punish them aren't maintaining order. They're perpetuating injustice. And discrimination doesn't end because people stop talking about it. It ends when people refuse to stay silent. Share this with educators, parents, students, and anyone who believes that speaking up about injustice should be encouraged, not punished. Subscribe to Real Justice Stories for more tales of discrimination confronted, systems held accountable, and the power of refusing to stay silent even when it's dangerous. Thank you for watching. Remember, the student you try to expel today for advocating against racism might have parents on the State Board of Education. But that shouldn't matter. Every student deserves fair treatment, not because of who their parents are, but because justice shouldn't require connections to power.